All right. So we're starting another stream. We are getting ready now. Hello, Topaz. And hello, Nick Jane? Welcome. You guys are just in time for us to start. Welcome, Nilly and Phyllis and everyone else who's joining. We are doing another live study session on this Wednesday morning. The topic today is going to be Rabbinic Judaism. Specifically, I'm going to be explaining what I learned from this book right here. Rabbinic Judaism Debunked. And I think you guys are going to be surprised by what we find when we start looking into it. Nora says it's going to be a good day. I hope that that's because we get to do this. That's at least part of why it's going to be a good day. User 62, good morning. Conservative Joe, good morning. Somebody's already sending likes. I appreciate that. If you're watching on YouTube, or now I'm actually streaming on Twitter as well, go ahead and like it. Leave comments. Feel free. Okay. So, we're going to try to get into this pretty quickly. For those of you who don't know me that well, I am the author of Maybe Everyone is Wrong, and a follow-up to that called Fire in the Rabbit Hole. And that's my link tree where you can find my podcast where I read these books for free, and my Telegram and my Discord channel if you want to be part of a community of Christians and have interesting discussions and ask me stuff. You can go to my Discord channel there. User says it's a good day because I'm on vacation. Lucky you. So, I'm very impressed by this book by Eitan Bar and Golan Brosh called Rabbinic Judaism Debunked. And I don't see any reason to delay starting to talk about this because I don't have a lot prepared aside from this book. And this book is... Let me read some of the contents. Let me read the chapters, okay? Chapter headings. Chapter 1, the ancestors of the rabbis. So if you want to know where the rabbis came from, you find out there. Chapter 2 is called Game of Thrones. Chapter 3 is the advent of the oral law. Chapter 4 is the rabbi's new covenant. Chapter 5 is the philosophy behind studying the oral law. Chapter 6 is the pagan roots of rabbinic customs. That's an interesting one. Sam and Mickey says, good morning. Glad to be here for these fruitful studies. I think today will be interesting because this is a topic that Christians, I think they understand. Most Christians think they understand. If you told them, what is Judaism about? They would say, oh, well, they're thinking of Orthodox Jews, and they're thinking they try to keep the Old Testament commands. That's what you'd think. They try to keep the Sabbath. You don't really understand why they dress the way they do. You don't really understand why they talk the way they do sometimes. But, they're basically, we read about that in the Old Testament, right? Madra Uchiha says, hey, Shalom, what's the topic? The topic is Rabbinic Judaism and what it is really about according to the authors of this book, Rabbinic Judaism Debunked by Eitan Bar and Golan Brosh, two Israeli Messianic Jews. We're reading the contents, the chapter headings for this book. There's the pagan roots of rabbinic customs, then the oral law in the Old Testament, the oral law in the New Testament, rabbinic atheistic revolution, that's a surprising one, the myth of the oral law, the foothold of the oral law today, and conclusion, the oral lie. These are very educational chapters. It says right in the beginning that the intention of the book is to present a vigorous critique of traditional Rabbinic Judaism, but that it is offered in the context of an intramural discussion between Jews who believe in Yeshua, Jesus, and those who do not yet follow him. It should not be understood as an attack on the Jewish people, but rather as a dispute between different sects within Judaism over the true interpretation of the Tanakh and the authority thereof. Because these are two Jewish authors who are writing about this, who grew up with Rabbinic Judaism. So, what does he say about the ancestors of the rabbis? Well, he says very clearly here in the first chapter, the rabbis were leaders of a sect that succeeded the Pharisees. The Pharisees were one of three major sects or groups which were founded and operated during the period of the Second Temple, along with the Sadducees and the Essenes. So he explains the origins of the Pharisees, which I found very interesting. I'll just read some here. It says, the Pharisees did not become a distinct group earlier than the year 150 BC because their name in Hebrew does not appear anywhere earlier. And moreover, other sources later than 150 BC give the impression that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes came to be at this time and not earlier. In fact, the Second Temple period was the bedrock upon which Jewish theology, as we know it today, grew up and developed. Now, the Second Temple period is a time when many Christians would assume that that's when they held on to the classic beliefs. They held on to the Moses teachings and the Old Testament teachings as we have them. But they did not necessarily. And of course, we know that by the time Jesus comes by, he's telling them that they have really distorted the teachings of God with their traditions. So obviously something bad happened in that time. Good morning, summertime. User is telling you guys to tap, so you guys better tap the screen. And also, if you hit the share button and then you copy the link, that's some sort of magic juice for, it's magic juice for the algorithm. User says, you seem distracted and tired today. The reason why it seems that way is because I just got off of a work shift and I didn't do a bunch of preparation. I knew I was going to talk about this, but I just finished a very busy work shift. So you're right that I am tired, but this is what I was planning on doing, and I'm just getting warmed up. So give me a minute here. I'm trying to decide how much of this to actually read, because I could read a lot of it, but I want to try to find the juicy sort of snippets that would actually help you. So he basically goes over how the Pharisees ended up trying to pass along a tradition that says that at Mount Sinai, God didn't just give the commands that were written down in the Old Testament. He actually gave something called the oral law. There's the written law and the oral law. The written law is what we find in the Old Testament. But the oral law was a separate bunch of commands that are secret, or were secret, and that there's a secret priesthood that passed along the oral traditions. And so the Pharisees and the rabbinic teachers, they maintain the lie of the oral tradition, the oral law, which they say is superior to the written law. So you, as the average Christian, you look at the Old Testament and you say, this is what Judaism is about. But they would counter and say, actually, that's the peasant version. That's the low-level version of Judaism that, the ignorant peasants sort of read. But the real masters of Judaism have a secret law that was passed down orally to only the special ones. And that's where the Sanhedrin and this idea of the 70 elders and everything eventually comes from. But really, the lie of the oral Torah comes out of the Babylonian period, where they're in exile, and then they try to say, while we were in Babylon, exiled from Jerusalem, which was destroyed, that's when we decided to finally start to write down some of these teachings. So they decided to make up a fake history in order to try to sell the idea that they had a new leadership, because they were becoming detached from the actual Old Testament laws. And they were jumping into this mixture with Babylon. They were spiritually fornicating with Babylon while they were there in exile. And you can read about some of the things they said at that time, and it's insane. Like, they said that God had actually blessed them. Welcome, Seamus. They had said God had actually blessed them by exiling them there, because it meant that all of their scholars, their rabbis, could gather together in the safety of Babylon and write out their teachings. And if you know anything about the Talmud, you should know that there is such a thing as the Babylonian Talmud. That's what it's called, because it was starting to be written in Babylon. And then when Zerubbabel and Nehemiah and these guys led the Jews back to Jerusalem, there was so many of them, so many Jews that decided to stay behind in Babylon. And Babylon was actually more popular than Jerusalem after that period. The Bible doesn't record that much, but it's a historical fact. And so there's actually this competition happening between Babylon and Jerusalem in Judaism for hundreds of years during the Second Temple period. And so there's a lot of confusion that comes out of that. A lot of the Second Temple writings, some comes out of Jerusalem, some comes out of Babylon, and they're trying to figure out, how do we continue to call ourselves Jews and practice and worship? And the ones in Babylon are saying, well, actually, we figured out, because of the oral law and our secret traditions, that we don't actually need a temple. We don't actually need a king. We don't need all that stuff that used to be done in the time of Moses and David and this kind of stuff. We can basically have Judaism without the traditions and without the law, really. So they turn into a kind of mysticism. And meanwhile, in Jerusalem, they're trying to recreate the original conditions. They're trying to go back all the way to Moses and Joshua. And so there's this weird struggle happening, and the intellectuals and the scholars are fighting about this. And of course, the politics of Jerusalem means that they have to make weird alliances with for example, Babylon, and then Persia, Greece, and eventually Rome. These four empires that Daniel talked about. And out of that, they have to make this weird political deal that the political class that comes out of that is the Pharisees, the ones who make this alliance with Rome. And that's why they're in power when Jesus comes by, because they've made an alliance with Rome. So, let me jump to chapter 5 here of this book that I'm talking about called Rabbinic Judaism Debunked. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on it. I've looked up some of the stuff afterwards independently just to try to verify it, and it looks like it's all completely verifiable. He has footnotes in the book that help point you in the right direction. A lot of it is in Hebrew. It's actually written for Jewish people to read. But a Christian can read this and try to follow along, and it's written in English. It's just the footnotes reference Hebrew writings, modern Hebrew. Chapter 5 is the philosophy behind studying the oral law. Here's what he says. This chapter and the next will deal with foreign philosophies and beliefs which penetrated the rabbinic religion. This chapter will focus mainly on the Greek philosophical influence of the four essential aspects of rabbinic Judaism and the oral law. A. Philosophers as rulers. The wise disciple stood at the very top of the hierarchy of the Jewish world. Their deep knowledge of the oral law gave them authority to govern the community. In other words, the most essential criterion by which a man could judge and rule was the measure of wisdom he manifested concerning the Talmud. And remember, the Talmud is the lies that came out of Babylon, about the fan fiction that they wrote about themselves, the story they told about how they had these traditions that were secretly passed down from Mount Sinai. So they measure who should be ruling the Jews by who is the master of the Talmud, not the Torah, not the actual writings of Moses and the law, but the Talmud. The rabbinic utopia is probably the only contemporary society which puts the intellectuals at the top of the pyramid. The closest existing model would be Plato's ideal philosophical government. No wonder that the members of the Sanhedrin, as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, for example, had to be knowledgeable in all wisdom, including the wisdom of the Greeks. Maimonides considers himself a disciple of Aristotle, and saw Moses as the chief philosopher, even referred to Rabbinic Judaism as a philosophical religion. So instead of being commanded by God through prophets and through miracles and power like it is in the real Old Testament, and these stories and promises and covenants and laws, it becomes a religion of philosophy, and that develops out of this Babylonian exile where they're not allowed to be in their city anymore, so they come up with their own way of carrying it on without Jerusalem. And so you can see how it becomes detached from the traditions, and it starts to morph into some sort of weird independent philosophy that you could take anywhere, even though originally it was very tied to the land and very tied to Jerusalem itself. B. Philosophical methods of learning the oral law. Rabbinic law, and in fact the whole literature of the sages, was influenced by Plato and Aristotelian philosophy, and therefore it is not surprising that the studies in Yeshiva are characterized by its endless contradictions and multiple arguments. The most important and influential encounter between Rabbinic Judaism and Greek philosophy probably took place in Alexandria, which prepared the ground for the wisdom of future sages. So by trying to mix Greek philosophy with Judaism, they create all sorts of contradictions, because, of course, they don't actually go together. So, and one of the things about ancient philosophy is that they had a dialectic. They had arguments between philosophers, and that's how they would arrive at new discoveries. See, in the real biblical Judaism, a real biblical Torah, God dictates things to the people, and he picks a leader over them, and it just is a straight line from the top to the bottom. But in this method, in the Talmud method, they have debates about the law, and they decide things by debating it. And so that's one of these things you can look for in when you're looking at Rabbinic Judaism. So it says, accordingly, the Babylonian Talmud reports that Rabbi Shimon's school accommodated 1,500 students, 500 of which studied Greek wisdom. The typical yeshiva is known for its heated debates about law, midrash, and more. In fact, some argue that the entire Mishnah is one great display of debates. The Talmud is a book of debates between different scholars, and that's why they say that it never ends. To this day, the rabbis still debate, and they discover new things to this day about the Old Testament, which of course is not accurate. I feel like TikTok is steadily throttling the stream because we had 50 viewers and now we're down to 18, which is funny because, I keep saying things like Jews and Judaism and rabbinic law and rabbis. Maybe it just doesn't like those, even though I'm literally teaching from a book written by Jewish scholars. So who knows what's going on with TikTok, or maybe people just aren't interested in this kind of stuff, whereas I am. Here's some things that also surprised me here. And if you guys have questions, feel free to ask questions. There's not a lot of chatting happening here either, so maybe this is one of those topics that people just don't have questions about, or maybe people aren't ready to have a conversation about Rabbinic Judaism and the Talmud. David says, good morning. Good morning. Welcome. So, chapter 2 of this book, which is called Rabbinic Judaism Debunked, is called Game of Thrones. And it says, ultimately it was a question of authority over the people of Israel. But how did the Pharisees manage to take the mandate, which was initially given by the Torah to the priests, and claim it as their own? Because the Pharisees were not the priest class. How did they become the absolute authority over Judaism? With the inevitable destruction of the Second Temple in 70 A.D., the priests found themselves standing on unfamiliar ground concerning their authority and their daily livelihood. Soon after, they had lost their leadership and prestige to the rabbis. So there was the priests, but the priests are different than the Pharisees. I hope you guys realize that. Shadow Rage says, Matthew 23, verse 2, Jesus refers to the throne of Moses that they made. You won't find instructions to do that in the Bible. I think it's also known as the seat of Moses, and that's where they would read the Old Testament from, right? I Defy You says, seems like Western governments are built on the Talmudic principles. You mean like debating and having intellectuals debate things in order to create new policies? Because that was also a very Greek thing. And I feel like Western governments are based heavily on the Greco-Roman system. And what actually happened is that Judaism, because they were ruled over by the Greeks and Hellenized, which is the term for ancient Jews being converted to the Greek way of thinking, it's actually the other way around. The Greeks heavily influenced Judaism to the point where their Talmud started to take on a very Greek angle, a very Greek mindset. And actually, by the time Jesus comes in, they're struggling to hang on to their Jewish identity because they've been living under Greek rule for so long. Most of them speak Greek at that point, and hanging on to their Jewish identity is difficult. You actually have Jews in the New Testament who have Greek names. Jews are starting to name their children with Greek names, and so Hellenizing was actually basically real Jewish identity was almost extinct by the time Jesus came in. And there was a hardcore group of the Pharisees, for example, who wanted to try to cling to it and not let Greek culture take over completely. That's my understanding. And so they fought, and they fought for traditions, and they fought for what they thought was the law. They thought it was, protecting their Jerusalem identity versus the Babylonian identity and the Alexandrian identity. Shadow Raid says the seat of Moses is where they would enact takanot, which are commandments. They claim to be able to make with Mosaic authority. Oh, I didn't know that was what they did, is they actually sat in that seat and pretended to be Moses. That's kind of absurd. So this is talking about after the second temple is destroyed. The priests, who are separate from the Pharisees, the priests actually don't have as much authority. Mickey says, jumped over to TikTok to boost the stream and counter the TikTok throttle. Hey, I appreciate it. Go ahead and ask questions if you want. Like I said, I didn't do a bunch of homework before I did this, but I know that this book has a lot of interesting stuff. So I'm just picking stuff out here, and we can discuss it. The temple gets destroyed. The priests no longer have the prestige that they used to. They're just basically all scattered, right? That's what happened after the second temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. And so there's a power struggle between the Pharisees and the priests. It says, a testimony to the fierce dispute between the leading sects of the Second Temple period is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where it is said about the Pharisees, deceivers of Ephraim, which by their lies of teaching, tongue of falsehood, and language of fraud will mislead many. The leader of the Pharisees is described by the Dead Sea Scrolls as the preacher of deception and the man of mockery, and he is accused of misleading many with deceitful teachings and even of detesting the written Torah. Because remember, the Pharisees were carrying on, ever since the Babylonian exile, this lie that they had a secret wisdom, a secret different religion than everyone else, and that they were the true authorities. Because the oral law, this is something that you have to understand. In the oral law, which is a deception, it's a satanic lie that they came up with while they were in Babylon, it is used in order to interpret the written law. It's the key that unlocks the true meaning of the written law. So you and me can go back and read the Old Testament with our own eyes. It's still preserved, and we can see what God commanded. But they will say, no, you don't actually understand anything until you have the oral law to interpret that. See, we have the secret wisdom that decodes the Old Testament. It's all riddles and mysteries. You can't actually understand what God was saying unless you have this oral Torah. And that's where the legalists today on TikTok, you will see them, they make a big deal about these rabbis who understand so much. And they do this really gross Luciferian trick where they, they'll teach people the alphabet in Hebrew, and they'll say this is the Aleph, and this is the Tav, and this is the whatever. And then they'll tell you a lie. They'll lie about which letter means which. And then when you tell it back to them, they ask you what it means. They'll say, no, that's not what it means. And then you say, well, but that's what you told me. And then they say, well, yes, that's what we told you, but do you not understand? We can tell you anything. You're relying on us to teach you. So I hope you understand that you really, you depend on us for wisdom. You don't actually go and read it yourself. We interpret it for you. That's what the Pharisees were all about. They were about trying to actually hide the truth of the Old Testament from the Jews in order to get them more dependent on the Pharisees. And so even the priests, who were trying to just carry on the traditions and the actual teachings of Judaism and of the Old Testament, they were sort of stuck. They were sort of stuck dealing with the Pharisees, who kind of had this air of authority because they would be so passionate about the law. They would condemn everybody, but at the same time they were hypocrites because they wouldn't actually follow what the law said. They made up their own oral Torah, and they had these debates, these Greek-style debates about what it meant, using the mystery of the oral Torah as their excuse. Nor says, trying to be separate from the world, but not separated to God. Virtue signaling, but not true virtue. Yeah, it's a fake religion. I Defy You says, does this blend with Kabbalah? Kabbalah comes in, I believe, Kabbalah is a thing that is manifesting the whole way through from Babylon already, but it really becomes empowered and specific during the medieval period around 1200 AD, because that's when they create the Zohar, which is this giant book of mysticism that they write in Spain, actually. And that's where Kabbalah really kicks off major. Kabbalah is also mysticism. Yes, Shadow Raid. Thomas says, in the first of Revelation, he wrote the letter to the churches. How do you know which one I belong to? That's a different topic, but I would say just use your own sense of things. And I think there's something you can learn from all of them. I don't think that it's a neatly divided up thing. For what it's worth, those letters were written to specific churches that were actually cities. If you think about even one state of America, how many cities are in one state? It might not be talking about entire nations and, generations across huge countries and stuff. It might be smaller than that, or it might be something we have to extrapolate and look at the principles behind it. So, Senpai says, do you still read a book a day by your new Lamborghini? I think you are in the wrong chat. I think you stumbled into the wrong live stream, if you're asking me that. So the ancient historian Yosef ben Matayahu, Josephus Flavius, reinforced this when he wrote that the Pharisees commanded Israel with traditional laws which were never a part of the written Torah or the written law, and therefore were rejected by the Sadducees. So you remember the Sadducees and the Pharisees are the two factions in the New Testament. You can actually read about them. The Sadducees denied the resurrection, and the Pharisees are the ones who were always trying to trick Jesus. So neither of them was actually correct. But the Sadducees tried to stick to just the text. And in response, Josephus made fierce arguments and disputes, or said that fierce arguments broke out between the two, because the Sadducees wanted to just go back to the text. The Pharisees wanted to add in the whole oral Torah deception. Baoli says, what do you think was the Pharisees' goal with this conspiracy? The goal was to control Judaism, because they still believed that the Jews were the chosen people. They still believed that, God was going to protect them. They just wanted to be the ones who were in charge of it politically, and basically to replace the priest class, because You have to realize how devastating the Babylonian exile was for all of them, where they realized that God was actually willing to destroy their homeland and exile them if they didn't do things correctly. But instead of learning the correct lesson, which was to humble themselves and follow the law better and call for the Messiah, they started to twist it in their mind about how they could maintain the power without the religion, without the true following of the written law. And so the Pharisees are trying to weasel their way out of the written law and create their own version of Judaism. Nor says, yes, it's always about control. People wanting to control other people's access to God. True, yeah, that's what it is. And Satan always tries to take over a religion and steer it in the wrong direction. I Defy You says, they were the equivalent of modern-day denominations. In a sense, yeah, they were competing to see who could dominate the culture. But remember, there's an actual stronghold of Jews in Babylon, the actual city of Neo-Babylon, which is modern-day Baghdad. There was a lot of Jews who stayed behind there when the other people went to go build the second temple and try to reclaim and rebuild the original style in Jerusalem. And you can read about that in Nehemiah and in Ezra, these books where they're building the second temple and everything's going wrong, and they're having to ask permission from pagan rulers in order to get permission to build these, because the whole land of Judea is conquered by pagan empires this whole time. First Babylon, then Persia, then Greece, then Rome. And so they never actually have freedom to actually carry out their big vision of the revived Judaism and Jewish identity. And then eventually you get the rebellion that leads up to it's what they have special holidays for it and stuff. It's I'm blanking on it now, but it's basically where this new royal class came up. These Jews were fighting the Romans, and they actually won their independence for a little bit. Somebody in the chat probably knows what I'm talking about. I should have it on the top of my head. Shadow Raid says, I've heard an argument that the group of magi that came with the gifts were Jews, and they were going off of the wisdom that Daniel left behind, the treasure being his inheritance. Well, you've heard that argument. I would be curious to know how biblical it is, but Mickey says the Maccabees. Yes, absolutely. That's what it is. The Maccabean Revolt. That's where they go and they fight off, the rule, and they establish their own royal ruling class through those who conquer. And then that twists into a compromise because they can't hold off the Romans forever. And so they have to start making deals with the Romans. And that's where you basically have the Pharisees stepping up into a protected, Roman recognized ruling class. And that's why the Pharisees are always trying to dominate in the New Testament. When Jesus is there, they're the ones dealing with the Romans and saying, crucify him, crucify him. And they're telling Pontius Pilate what to do. It's because the Pharisees are the descendants of the Maccabeans. The Maccabeans take over, and then they make a deal with the Romans to share governance, basically. And this also, by the way, is why I think the statue in Daniel with the toes that are mixed clay and iron is a reference to the Second Temple period and the the mixture they were trying to create of Roman and Jewish, because the Jewish was the clay and iron was Rome, and they didn't mix, but Herod was this attempt at a Roman Jewish ruler who rebuilds the temple that they eventually see there. I actually think that people have really twisted around that interpretation of the statue, and that the clay and iron mixing together is the Second Temple period when Jesus comes. And so yeah, they're trying to mix themselves together with that. I'm simplifying it a little bit, but the Pharisees, Josephus wrote that Queen Alexandra gave the Pharisees full authority over the people and renewed all their traditional rulings. And Alexandra handed over the priesthood to the Hyrcanus, over to Hyrcanus II, and the legal systems over to the Pharisees. This was an extremely important turning point for the Jewish world, the beginning of an era in which every new religious development in Judaism would carry a legal dimension. So that's, I believe, the Greek Alexandra handing things over to the Pharisees. Then they start to turn everything into legalism, whereas before it wasn't. And the priests would mediate things, but instead now it becomes the Pharisees ruling over and turning everything into laws. I Defy You says, so you're an amillennialist? I don't know what that means. I literally don't know what that means. I've heard people say different millennial, this and that. I believe that the millennium, the millennial kingdom is going to happen when Revelation says it's going to happen, which is in the future after the trumpets, and we are not there yet. Iron and clay feet seems to repeat throughout history, says Nor. It does if you don't look at it closely. I mean, remember that the iron and clay gets shattered by the rock that comes down that is formed without hands. Shatterade says, I've never heard that take on Daniel's statue's toes. That's really cool. Yeah, I think that that's what it is. That image of the statue, one of the things that people don't notice, and it's just a logical thing, is that a statue that represents a timeline that's going from the head down to the chest, down to the waist, down to the legs, and then down to the feet and even the toes. It's a proportional timeline. It's not going to explain thousands of years of history where the head to the torso is like less than 100 years, and the torso to the waist is like 100 years, and down to the knees is like a couple hundred years, and then once you get down to the toes, people think it's going to go on for thousands of years, and that would just visually not make any sense, or unless these toes are stretched out for hundreds of miles. If you think of it as a timeline, and it's just going down in order, eventually you reach the toes around the exact same time that Jesus would have come. And what does Jesus represent? He represents the stone that is formed without hands. He smashes the toes, just as Jesus did destroy the system of mixed Judaism and Roman rule in Judea. He destroyed, the temple was rent, was broken open when he was on the cross, and spiritually he broke the power of this weird hybrid of Roman and Jewish rule, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the system that was around at that time. And the confusion, which is very deliberate, comes around because people think that once the toes are smashed and the whole statue crumbles over time and gets blown away by the wind, they think that that means that the political power of Rome will disappear. No, the political power of Rome doesn't disappear. The spiritual ruling authority of the angels that are put in charge of that, every religion in that system from Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome has a very strong religious system behind it, a false god behind it. And one gets replaced by the other. So there's these different religions that rule over each of them. And that's what Jesus smashed. And then, of course, Satan gives his throne to Rome. And then that's how the beast is healed. In Revelation, there's the beast that had the wounded head that gets revived when Satan gives him his throne and his authority. That's what happens with Rome. Rome is spiritually defeated, and then when Constantine comes by, he sees this vision of the cross, and he says, I am now a Christian, even though he doesn't know anything about Christ. He just saw a vision of a cross in the sky, and then he starts to take over the pagan religions and claim to be Christian, and Satan ultimately is the one who's controlling Constantine there, and Rome becomes satanic and a false imitation of Christianity. But I do think that the spiritual event happens when, with the toes and the clay and the iron, is the mixture of Judaism and Rome, since Rome is definitely the iron, and Jews were not powerful at all, and so they were like clay. They were made out of a very plain material like clay, whereas Rome was very glorious and powerful and had an empire like steel, and they just couldn't mix. After the Second Temple was destroyed, the Pharisees at last had the opportunity to implement their religious revolution, to create a national body which did not need a specific physical location to stand on, a body which would be governed by their teachings and would exist universally. This is where the idea of the diaspora of the Jews, where they spread around the world, but they're all united in the religious Talmudic system, kind of gets its big start, is when the second temple. Well, I guess after the Second Temple was destroyed, and the Second Temple is destroyed in the siege of Rome in 70 A.D. So yes, that's what they're talking about. It says, in sharp contrast to the priests, the Pharisees denied both the dynastic system upon which the Sadducees inherited their authority and the source of authority for divine knowledge. They rejected the exclusivity of the Sadducees as priests who served in the temple. The rabbis also declared that prophecy had ceased to exist and that writings made by the priests were therefore null and void. After the destruction of the temple, they claimed authority to determine the schedule of feasts, an authority that belonged to the priests until then. So this is a power grab. It is a takeover. Thomas says, love you live. Have to go to work. God bless you and everyone here. Thank you for joining us. I Defy You says, I was under the impression the awe was people who believed Jesus already returned. Yeah, we're talking about all-millennialism. I don't really understand that. I Defy You says Jesus returned at 70 A.D. There's no evidence of that. Nunaki says, is Jesus God? Yes, he is. God is Love says, yesterday I received a message from Brother in Christ on YouTube. He said if you don't keep the commandment, you don't lose, if you don't keep the commandment, you lose your salvation. He said that we don't have the right calendar. What do you think? I think that that's a satanic deceiver who wants to try to nullify the sacrifice of Christ by trying to drag the law into the new covenant when it doesn't fit. And I don't care what the calendar is. I don't need a calendar. Jesus didn't tell me to keep the calendar. The commandments that we're supposed to keep are the ones that Jesus gives us, not the ones that Moses gave the Israelites. And I do keep the commands of Jesus, which is to love my neighbor and to carry my cross and to, do unto others as I would have them do unto me. That by that we fulfill the law. So you are dealing with a classic legalist deceiver there. And that's not far from what we're reading about right here. Rabbinic Judaism Debunked. I am discussing ideas from here by Eitan Bar and Golan Brosh. I know it's backwards, but Rabbinic Judaism Debunked, I highly recommend. Oh, I Defy You clarifies, I don't believe Jesus already returned. You were just clarifying what that meant, I suppose. Big T says, is baptism necessary for salvation? We talked about that the other day. It is not necessary for salvation, but it is a nice thing to do, and you should do it if you can. So, what we're reading about is how the Pharisees took over ruling Judaism after the temple was destroyed because the priests were connected to that physical temple. But the Pharisees weren't. The Pharisees had a philosophy, a pagan-style philosophy, that they would debate things and they would come up with laws. Everything they would interpret from the Old Testament, they would create laws around it. And so they wanted to just be a ruling legal body that would rule over the Jews no matter where they were in the entire world. Does that sound familiar? It should, because that is the Rabbinic Judaism that we have today. You have rabbis who are sort of in a loose network around the world, and they have debates with each other over moral issues, and then they try to convince Jews that this is the equivalent, their conclusions are the equivalent to God's authority. They're revealing new wisdom using the oral Torah system. It's not godly. That's not what you read about in the Old Testament. That's not what God instituted. It's what Jesus condemned when Jesus was in Jerusalem. Shadow Raid Legend says, Jesus frequently referred to rabbinic doctrine as yeast. Yeah, yeast that you're not supposed to allow in because it's going to spread throughout the whole loaf and then it becomes corrupted. That's the traditions and the ideology of the Pharisees, especially. I mean, even the Sadducees didn't have things right. And people argue that Jesus was an Essene, and they make this thing about the Essenes being the true sect or whatever. Look, the point is that they were supposed to be pure, and once the Messiah comes, he fulfills the law, and he has the kingdom, and everything becomes about the kingdom. It stops being about the law. The law is fulfilled, and therefore it's like a contract being fulfilled. It's no longer necessary, and you can then move on to the reward for fulfilling it, which is the kingdom. I Defy You says the Roman Catholic Church works the same way, correct? Well, certainly in the sense that they want to have a controlling and dominant system over all of Christianity and claim to have the authority to make new laws and new commandments and change the times and enforce feasts and festivals and rituals and confessions and all these things. There's a lot of overlap between the Catholic Church and Rabbinic Judaism. Now, there's some things here that go so far that I have to try to find them again. I should have actually highlighted them, but I didn't want to write in the book because I don't like when the books get all marked up. So here's something interesting. The sages of the Talmud, these rabbis, argued that even today, whatever a disciple would ask his rabbi, God has already given the answer to Moses at Mount Sinai. So they claim they're not making up anything new. They claim that they're only interpreting the answers that were given to Moses at Sinai. So they glorify the revelation at Sinai with the oral law. They say, thus, the oral law takes on a much broader meaning than just the Mishnah and the Talmud. It is an organic judicial system of laws which keeps expanding with new relevant rulings that fit the ever-changing circumstances. So there's what's written, and then there's another layer of what's interpreted, and then there's another layer of these rabbinic debates. And ultimately, it's this organic system where even though there's a very simple command originally, there has to be an infinite number of revisits and reinterpretation of that law to fit modern society and how an Orthodox Jew could live in modern society. And that's where you get some really crazy rulings about, for example, I could hardly even believe this, but in New York City, Orthodox Jews have taken a wire, a cable, and stretched it across all these balconies of all these apartment buildings and big buildings around New York City. Why do they have this cable running around it all? Well, according to the law, according to their interpretation of the law, you're not allowed to go outside of your home on Sabbath. But by creating this cable system around the city, they claim that that cable represents their home. And so they can leave, they can go outside around the streets and go to their favorite shops and do things around town because they're within this wire system that is representative of their home. So this is the kind of strange legalistic thinking that you get on when you're stuck in this ancient system that you're trying to reinterpret for modern day. And it's sad because, again, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, and he would give them freedom from the law. He would give them peace. He would give them a new spirit, and they could do all of the things that the law really commands on a spiritual level. But they're stuck with these rabbis trying to hide Jesus from them. Baoli says, when doing research about all these lies of the enemy and trying to expose them, are you ever scared of becoming like the church of Ephesus? What is the church of Ephesus referencing there? I Defy You says, that's a real stretch, no pun intended. Yes, it is. Nora says, don't mark up books. That's OCD. I have CDO. Same thing, but the letters O and R as they should be. I don't think that I'm OCD, and in fact, I do mark up some of my books, but this one in particular, it's like there's so many things that I would mark up that it would almost just be completely marked up and it wouldn't even help, because if you underline every second sentence, it's not really helpful. This book is so short. It's a very thin book, but it's so packed with interesting information that I don't know what to mark up first. I don't know what to emphasize, because it's like everything is important for different reasons. It's just, this whole book took me by surprise. I didn't expect it to be so educational. Shadow Raid says, when Jesus healed the lame man and told him to pick up his mat and walk, he broke the Pharisaical rule about what they define as your home on Sabbath. That's what I love about Jesus. Many of his healings flew in the face of their man-made rules. Well, Jesus really did bring things back to a matter of principle and didn't allow a legalistic interpretation to stop him from doing what was correct in principle. And the philosophy of the Pharisees does the opposite of that. Even though it's a philosophy, and in that sense they could have interpreted things generously and mercifully in order to help the people and be more Christ-like, although they wouldn't have known what Christ was back then, but during the Second Temple period, they could have been more generous with people. They went the opposite way. They created a philosophy of strictness and of legalism. So they used the power of philosophy and principle, but they did it backwards in order to further enslave people. And that's what legalism is all about. It says here the first appearance of the term oral law takes place in the Babylonian Talmud, where it is explicitly mentioned in 3 different tractates. This is rather surprising for a text that one would expect to promote the novel idea of the oral law. As mentioned, the most ancient written rabbinic documents are dated no earlier than the 2nd or 3rd century AD. That's after Jesus. The most ancient written rabbinic documents are dated no earlier than the 2nd and 3rd century AD, and some say even towards the end of the 1st millennium. In other words, there is no written source earlier than the 2nd century AD which explicitly links the Pharisaic laws to the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Nevertheless, in complete disregard of this fact, or perhaps precisely in light of it, the rabbis argued that Moses was not the only one who knew the oral law. According to the literature, all the great figures of the Bible used to study and meditate on it. Accordingly, Adam and Eve, listen to this, Adam and Eve learned the oral law given at Mount Sinai. Huh? What? Adam and Eve learned the oral law at Mount Sinai that was given at Mount Sinai. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob studied in a yeshiva. Now, I'm going to look up what a yeshiva is because I did that before, but I've forgotten since then what a yeshiva is. I think it's just a place where you learn the Talmud. Yeah, it's an academy for advanced study of Jewish texts, primarily the Talmud. So, according to the Talmud itself, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob studied in a special school that taught teachings that were received by Moses, who came, of course, hundreds of years later than them. So did Joshua, King David, and others. The value of studying the oral law is so great, according to the Talmud, that according to the Talmud, I don't even want to say this out loud because it angers me to even read this, but I have to read it because otherwise you won't know it. According to the Talmud, the value of studying oral law is so great that according to the Talmud, even God himself spends the first 3 hours of every day studying the oral law in heaven. God himself studies what the rabbis taught in their Babylonian Talmud. That's what they claim. It is absolute satanic, unapologetic blasphemy. For 3 hours every day, they say God has to study what they wrote. They think they are above God himself. This is why I'm telling you to get this book, Rabbinic Judaism Debunked. You will not believe how explosively these guys expose the Rabbinic Judaism and Talmudic system. I thought I knew some of the crazy stuff that was in the Talmud. I had no idea that it could possibly have been this bad. This is written by Eitan Bar and Golan Brosh, 2 Jews who grew up in this system believing these things. And then when they found Jesus Christ, they realized that everything they were taught growing up was a lie. And they are now exposing it. And God bless them for exposing it in ways that we can understand. nor says, I can't believe people would believe that. Ultimate pride. It's not just ultimate pride. It is, imagine how iron tight the grip of the rabbis are on the people if they claim to have the power to essentially write instructions for God himself. God love says, the great I am studies blasphemy. Absolutely. Adam and Eve are studying. It's not about accuracy. See, this is the thing. We as Christians, we love the Old Testament. We believe the Old Testament is a source of truth and wisdom that you can interpret with the Holy Spirit. But we stick with the text. They don't care about the text. To them, it's just raw material to be used for their own agendas. And I'm speaking specifically of these rabbis and such as Maimonides and these other scholars. I'm not making a generalization about Jews in general. The general Jewish population around the world has no idea how tricked they've been, just like the Catholics. The average Catholic doesn't realize how bad the papacy is, how bad the Vatican is. It's a system of keeping people ignorant. So I'm going to read this again. The value of studying the oral law was so great that according to the Talmud, even God himself spends the first 3 hours of each day studying the oral law in heaven. And he has a citation for where you can find that. It is in the B Talmud. I'm guessing that's the Babylonian Talmud. In the Avodah Zarah 3b, if you had the Talmud, you could look that up. He actually has the source. It says, and I will continue here, in fact, the Talmud records a dispute between God and the heavenly Yeshiva of the righteous rabbis' souls. Remember, the Yeshiva is an academy for studying Jewish texts. This is long after Moses. In fact, like he said just earlier, the earliest writings of these rabbis was in the year 200, 100 or 200 AD, after Jesus already. But they claim to go all the way back to Sinai, and they claim that they have secret knowledge that even God has to learn from. And it says, it records a dispute between God and the heavenly Yeshiva, so the heavenly academy, of the righteous rabbis' souls, over a certain skin lesion. God argued that the lesion was pure, but the rabbis disagreed. In order to resolve the dispute, Rav Bar Nachamai was invited to heaven, and he declared in favor of God. So they specially ascended one of their rabbis up to heaven to solve this dispute between God and the rabbis about a skin lesion. Is it pure? Is it not pure? We can't just trust God. We can't trust our rabbis. You know, it's all about this Greek dialectic debate system that they inherited from Plato and Aristotle, where these great intellectual philosophers argue with each other to decide what the next philosophy is. And so here, they're putting God on the same level and their own scholars on the same level, so that they have to have these disputes in heaven. There's a heavenly dispute going on, and they need a rabbi from earth to go up to heaven and settle the dispute because, you know, otherwise it would be a tie. Maimonides taught, this is what Shadow Raid Legend says, Maimonides taught that the 10th red heifer to ever be sacrificed would be conducted by Messiah. We remember what happened to Job. Who do these people think we are, challenging God? Nor says Satan puts himself above God. So yeah, anything like that comes from Satan. Gabriel is just laughing at it. You know, I would laugh at it too, except on some level it hurts my soul to know how many, they want to worship God. They want to understand religion, but they're raised in a system that is designed from the ground up to turn them against the truth. And it's so sad you could laugh. Baoli says if the rabbi wasn't there, God could have been wrong. That's what they're arguing. Thanks, Rabbi. Thumbs up. Yeah. So, guys, this is why I'm telling you this book, Rabbinic Judaism Debunked, is a treasure. You would not have known this if I didn't tell you, because no one is talking about this on TikTok. No one is talking about this on YouTube. It is it's almost like classified information. But these God-fearing, Jesus-worshiping, Messianic Jews have done us a service to expose the secrets from within that system and tell us in plain English just how insane it gets. Adam and Eve studied in a yeshiva, studying the Jewish texts of the Talmud. What? God is debating with rabbis. God himself studies the Talmud 3 hours a day to start his day. This is the kind of stuff that it actually is taught by the modern Pharisees, the rabbinic system. And then they want to have a house of one, a church where Christians and Muslims and these people, the Rabbinic Judaism, Orthodox, as they call themselves, although there's nothing Orthodox about them, we can all worship the same God, and we're all equally welcomed into this one religion. We have the same God, they say. I don't have a God that consults with rabbis. I don't know about you, but my God is the creator of the universe and is infinitely superior to any human and doesn't need our advice for anything. He's the God of all wisdom. Shar says it's not God's will that any man should perish, but these people are being led astray. Yeah, I mean, I want the best for these people, and I hope that they find the truth in Jesus Christ and humble themselves, and then we get more people coming out and exposing this. We want more people like I-10 Bar and Golan Brosh to come out of that system and tell us. And also the same thing happens with Catholicism. I will remind you, when an ex-Catholic priest comes out of that system, you will hear things that will make your head spin. They will tell you things about the way the Catholic system works that will shame you and shock you like you wouldn't believe. And ex-Jesuits are the most powerful yet. Like the great, I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. I just had it. The Jesuit priest who came out of that and started to tell people what was going on. Anyway, my mind is on this, but ex-Jesuit priests do the same thing, and you learn stuff from them that you would never normally learn. You can read the Bible all day and you won't learn it because it's not in the Bible. It's in their crazy system. Perceive Zero says, wow, straight from Satan, like Pharisees spreading the lie Jesus' body was stolen. Absolutely, because they hate Jesus. So they have to do something. They killed Jesus. The Pharisees killed Jesus. What do you think they did? They didn't just walk around after that and, accept the Christians and accept that it's an equal religion. No, they had to keep the lie going. They had to try to bury Jesus again. They had to try to keep the Jews who were turning to Jesus at that time because of Paul, because of John, because of Peter and all the Jewish disciples. They had to try to get Christianity out of that system. And meanwhile, all of them were starting to convert the Greeks and convert the Romans. So not only were they getting Jews involved, they were getting the rulers of the Jews, the provincial rulers of Rome, which ruled over Judea. They were starting to turn to Christ. And so there's pressure from below and pressure from above. Governors of Rome were starting to believe in Jesus. You can read about that in Paul talking to that authority figure, and he says, today you almost, made me a Christian, or whatever he says. They're winning over the world because they're doing miracles, they're healing people, they're telling the truth, the Holy Spirit is speaking through them, they have all this power. And meanwhile, these Pharisees, what do they have? Fairy tales, lies, guilt, guilt and guilt and guilt and more guilt. You are guilty under the law. Follow the law. You're guilty under the law. If you pile on enough guilt on a person, they'll be afraid to reach out to Jesus. They'll think, I just have to follow the law. And then they make up more laws. This is why legalism today is one of the strongest poisons, because it taps into an ancient evil tradition of trying to deny Jesus and deny the forgiveness that he provides and keep you under a legalistic system that traces back right to Satan. Nor says kept secret because a lot of brainwashing needed before it's told for it to be accepted. Shadow Raid Legend says God also says that he will allow people to teach falsely as a test to see who loves him. Yeah, actually there's a lot of prophecies around Daniel and Ezekiel about how God is going to allow false prophets and false teachers to come in and lead the people astray because they hated his truth. And so he's going to give them what they want, which is lies. He's going to allow them to lead astray. Cultivate Kindness. Good morning. I'm always late, but I will watch later. No problem. Watch it later on YouTube. It's going to be here. It'll be available for you on YouTube. So guys, I want you to understand the significance of what we're reading here, because you're getting an insight into a world that is cut off from us. You're getting an insight into a system that millions of people actually currently believe in, and they practice, and they claim to be worshiping the God of the Old Testament, and they are so far from it, they don't understand anything about it. God is Love says, that's why the elites visited the Pope. They're all working for Satan, and all together, that's why they want the Chrislam for this fallen world. Well, they want anything except true Christianity. I mean, they'll take any deception they can get. New Age, atheism, materialism, some sort of weirdo false version of Christianity, Catholicism, Islam. They don't care what it is as long as it's not the real Christianity. That's what Satan is all about. Nor says Jesuits are about the root of all evil. They love money. Well, actually, Jesuits make a vow of poverty. They're not even allowed to have wealth, although the Jesuits as a organization has some of the most wealth in the history of the world. So it's kind of funny because they're a military order and their members are strictly forbidden to own things, but yet they do everything for their organization, and they certainly do pile up money for their operations that they do, which is not the same as the rest of the clergy of the Catholic Church, which spends a lot on themselves. Jesuits tend to spend things on their operation, which is why they're so powerful. They have the vision and the discipline to use their money strategically and not waste it on fancy robes and huge properties. Susan Huston says, "Good morning." Good morning. We are learning some amazing information from a book called Rabbinic Judaism Debunked. You can see the cover there. I know it's backwards. By Eitan Bar and Golan Brosh. These are Jesus-believing Jews. They love Jesus, and they are trying to help convert their fellow Jews to believe in him by exposing how the oral tradition, the oral law, is a lie. So, let's see if we can find something else here. It says, as emphasized, the rabbinic religion was based totally on the oral tradition. Therefore, the sages did all that was within their power to elevate its status among Israel and to persuade the people that there was absolutely nothing more important than to study the oral law, day and night for as long as they lived. Hence, rabbinic literature is full of praise for the importance and the virtues of the oral law, so much so that the actual act of learning it has become a value in and of itself. The rabbis argued that studying the oral law was greater, get this is in a time after the temple has been destroyed. For the 1,000+ years that the temple was destroyed after Jesus, they said studying the oral law was greater than rebuilding the temple, more significant than honoring one's parents, and even greater than saving lives. And remember that the oral law is whatever they make up. So, complete servitude and worship of their teachings is better and more important than rebuilding the temple, saving lives, or honoring your own parents. The rabbi's idea of Judaism was all about education. So learning the oral law became nothing short of a holy and divine task. Thus, studying the oral law became both the purpose for living and a responsibility which would last throughout life. Concerning the age in which one would start studying rabbinic teachings, the norm was to begin when the child had reached 5 years old. That's how young they start indoctrinating them into that system. Although some rabbis went so far as to argue that teaching the oral law should start from birth, and even when the baby is still in the mother's womb, of course. This was done due to the belief that what is being taught in an early stage would remain in the mind forever. Oh my goodness. God, please help these people. You know, it says here, the sages elevated the status of the oral law, and in doing so, they also elevated their own status, of course, because they create the oral law. They've sanctified themselves by turning their names into lucky charms, which one could say in times of trouble. So people would actually call out to these rabbinic scholars instead of calling out to God. The rabbis demanded the honor that was due to kings and of God himself. They did not stop there, but taught that their sayings are more serious than the words of prophets, and that a rabbi is better than a prophet. Did you guys know this about rabbis? When you see rabbis, there's synagogues, there's rabbinic rabbis will be on various programs, TV specials, documentaries. Sometimes they Christians go and talk to the rabbis. Did you know that they claim that their wisdom is greater than that of prophets? and of God himself. Therefore, they threatened that anyone who dared to disobey their rulings would be executed in this world and suffer in the world to come. You are literally worthy of death if you disobeyed their rulings. Now, we're talking about a complete system of enslavement. That's what the Jewish people have unfortunately, very tragically, been subjected to in the time since Jesus. Let's see the comments here. Tumbleweed says, Exodus 34:14, he is a jealous God, but one of the ways of true divinity and spirituality is Stoicism. It's confusing. Well, Stoicism is not anything to do with true divinity or spirituality. Stoicism is a Greek philosophy about, it's about being a man. That's basically what it is, how to be a man. It's not true spirituality. And it came about after Jesus, I believe, and basically stole a bunch of ideas from Jesus. And there's nothing that special about Stoicism. Shadow Raid Legend says, Roman Catholicism does the same thing, calling out to saints. Interesting. Absolutely. They have committees to decide who can become a saint. You have to have done a miracle. You have to have done something else. And then they have these councils to decide who can become a saint. And then you can, every day has its own saint. And all aspects of life has its own saint. So if you want, good mileage on your car that you just bought, you have a saint for the saint of mileage on cars. If you want to, have a good breakfast cereal, then you have the saint of the breakfast cereal, and they have a saint for everything. And then they have All Saints Day, which is the day when they worship all the saints at once, and they, of course, deny that they're worshiping them. They just pray to them and, pray to them, and meanwhile they, they call out to them. I'm exaggerating, of course, but not much if you read about all the different saints that there are. And likewise, these rabbis ask people to call out to them, these old sages and rabbis. And they say that you are worthy of death if you defy their rulings and you think you know better than them. Which, by the way, was heresy in the Catholic Church. And they would kill anyone who defied the teachings. Christy says, you're being ridiculous about things you don't know about. What's so ridiculous about it when my ancestors were murdered for not going along with the lies of the Pope? I'm pretty sure I know what I'm talking about because there's hundreds of years of documented history of slaughter of the Catholic Church, killing innocent Christians who simply didn't want to believe the lies of the Catholic clergy. So you can go ahead and explain to me what I'm being ridiculous about. And the rabbis here have the same system in their own way. Let's see here. So it says, in contrast to those who denied the power and authority of the rabbis, those who carried the prestigious title of Talmid Chacham, meaning a wise disciple of Talmud, were exalted above the rest and rewarded with all sorts of benefits. He who hosts a wise disciple in his home and gives him from his assets, it is as if he had brought sacrifices before God. So if you give one of these rabbis a bunch of money, it's like you sacrifice to God. That's what they want you to believe. He who gives money to a wise disciple would inherit heaven. And he has footnotes for these. He's citing all sorts of sources. I'm not quoting those sources, but they're in the different Talmuds, the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. It says that wise disciples are exempt from paying taxes. So they get all these gifts from everyone in the community, and they don't have to pay any taxes. And I read an article just recently that was talking about how Orthodox Judaism in Jerusalem is this huge conundrum for the economy, because it's so profitable to be one of these sages, one of these full-time studiers of the Talmud, that everyone wants to become part of it and get a free light living, a government-funded, taxpayer-funded lifestyle where they don't pay any taxes and they get all this money. And so it's becoming an increasing burden on all the working class people. And meanwhile, these people are becoming, from one point of view, they're parasites. They're sucking money out of the community and piling it up for themselves as these full-time students of the Talmud. And then it went on to say, this article said, that this is the model for the future of all of mankind. Because once we have smart cities and AI and robots taking over and replacing all of our jobs, we're going to need something to do all day. And so they were saying that the Rabbinic Judaism, Orthodox, full-time Yeshiva teachers and students of the Talmud are this futuristic people who can content themselves with doing nothing and producing nothing and doing no work and having no value to society other than to be busy studying all day. So this system is actually controversial because of the strain it has on an economy, but they're saying that with enough robots and AI, we won't need to work anyway, and then we'll be the ones trying to imitate them. It's absolutely a different world, I'm telling you. And we've been going for an hour and a half. We're going to go for a little bit longer here. But we hit some of the main points. And I want you to buy this book because I know I'm quoting from it. And this book, they don't want you to quote a lot from it because they have the copyright, of course. They want you to, support them in their ministry if you're going to learn all this stuff from them. I hope you guys get Rabbinic Judaism Debunked. I'm not being paid anything to talk about it or promote it at all. It's just a genuinely mind-blowing book. And if you can get a copy, you will learn so many things. And I hope that TikTok starts to pick up on this, the different Christian communities here. We can start talking about how crazy the Talmud actually is. Perceive Zero says Noahide laws. These will be enforced soon, I believe. Well, there is definitely plans to try to make Noahide laws enforced. So far, I don't believe it's been enforced at all. But the idea that the Noahide laws would suddenly come into effect and then Christians would be accused of idolatry, which is a crime worthy of being beheaded in the Noahide laws, is interesting because it means Christians could be mass beheaded right at the end. And what do we see in Revelation when Jesus comes and establishes his kingdom on earth? You see a bunch of martyrs who have had their heads cut off. And they're the ones that get the power and authority. Somebody asked, when was it written? And somebody else asked who the authors are. So I will tell you. This was published by One for Israel Ministry. You can go to oneforisrael.org if you want to go to their website. The authors are Dr. Eitan Bar and Dr. Golan Brosh. And it is copyright 2019. 2019. The publisher is One for Israel. Written by Eitan Bar and Golan Brosh. Look up Rabbinic Judaism Debunked. Look for this cover if you want this exact copy that I have. It is a thin book. It is full of footnotes. and they do some very interesting stuff in ministry in Israel. Shadow Raid Legend says he's heard of them before. They have other books that sound also very interesting. Defenders of Jesus Christ says the book is available on zlib.org for free via PDF. I would still suggest that you get it, you pay for it if you can afford it, because that would actually monetarily support them. And the book is definitely going to be something you're actually going to read more likely. If you're anything like me, you can only read so much of a PDF before your eyes start to glaze over, but I can read a book no problem from front to back and remember it, and I have it in my library, and I pick it up, and I much prefer physical books over giant PDFs. So guys, there's actually more stuff in here that is nuts, but we don't have time to go over it all now. I wasn't intending to go over it all now. I just wanted to give you a taste of it all. Here's some stuff from chapter 6. Maybe we can finish with this. He says, they say in chapter 6, which is called the pagan roots of rabbinic customs. I told you about how Greece and Babylon and Rome all had their influence in there. David says it is also free in Kindle Unlimited, just an FYI. I have a Kindle, one of those paper screen things where it's a reader. It doesn't shine a light. It actually has a neutral paper-like screen that you can read from, and that is a very cool way of reading books. I've read a lot on a Kindle that has one of those, and I guess if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can get the book for free on there. I don't think I have Kindle Unlimited, but whatever you got to do, I suggest you read this, and then I suggest you start talking to your family members and people in your churches and stuff about this, and just educate everyone on this. You know, let's spread some knowledge on this very obscure and controversial and weird topic that we could maybe be helping our Jewish people in our communities or around the world using the internet if we shine a light on some of this stuff. Because we're doing this out of love. God is love says, me too, I love to keep the books in my hands. I'm an old school for that. Yeah, I'm the same way. I want to have a physical book if I can. I should probably get multiple copies of this book, honestly, and just start handing them out to people. But anyway, so it says, the previous chapters dealt with the philosophical rabbinic features, which are deeply rooted in the Greek mindset. This chapter examines the pagan roots of only 5 out of many more important practices of Rabbinic Judaism. I'm going to read just one of them, okay? I don't want to give away the whole book. The first one they mention is the repetition of mantras. It says, a mantra is defined as an expression of syllables, words, and sentences spoken in the form of an ongoing repetition, in the belief that this action releases spiritual powers. Apparently, the source of mantras was Hinduism and was originally made in the Sanskrit language. Today, many religions have elements of mantras that are used as parts of regular prayers. Rabbinic Judaism is filled with special mantras, which are used as good luck charms. For example, in order to find something that has been lost, one can chant the name of Rabbi Meir 3 times. Remember that comment from TikTok here of somebody who said, I'm being ridiculous? You're being ridiculous. You don't know what you're talking about. A saint for mileage on your car? What are you talking about? How about finding something that you lost? You can just chant 3 times Rabbi Mar, or Meir, or Meyer, whatever it's spelt as, and you're going to have good luck finding that object. One could chant certain prescribed verses from the Psalms in order to escape any trouble, according to the Talmud. Saying verses that begin and end with the letter Nun, the Hebrew letter Nun, provides protection from the evil eye. and evil speech, meaning gossip and witchcraft. So if it starts and ends with the letter none, you can be magically protected from witchcraft. Mickey, here we go. Mickey says, my dad, an ex-Catholic, said St. Augustus would help his mom find stuff. Where is that in the New Testament? Can someone tell me? Is it in Ephesians? Was it in Romans? Where was that thing about repeatedly calling out to dead saints in order to find crap that you lost? Something else is going on here. And if it works, that's even more crazy, because that means demons are listening and responding to these names. I would prefer that there's just nothing to it and it's all coincidence if somebody finds something after doing this. But if it actually seems to work, we're talking about satanic and demonic interference in these evil systems. Susan Huston says, it's seriously weird how people actually believe this. Defenders of Jesus Christ says, sorcerers and idolaters will burn in the lake of fire. And I think a lot of them will think, hey, wasn't I being godly? I prayed to the saints. Wasn't that what I was supposed to do? It was St. Augustus. It was Rabbi Meir. I was just calling on these good people. What's the problem? Bin says, yep, growing up Catholic, we prayed to him to find things. Username Allergic to Bullshit says, mantras were originally used as a rite of passage for travelers across rivers and mountains. Same with murdas. I did not know that, but I'll take your word for it. Ben says, and bury a statue of Mary on our property to sell our house. Yikes. That's a big yikes for me, brothers and sisters. You bury a statue of Mary in order to sell your house. I would really hate to find out that the house that I bought had a statue of Mary buried in it. That would creep me right out. Sandy says, consult with the dead equals demonic. I think that's a good point. It's a form of necromancy. Ben says, I cried so much when I learned the truth. You know, I would too, because I love the truth. And if I was raised in a system that had lied to me for so long, and there was even demonic activity going on, I would be devastated. And thankfully, I grew up as a Mennonite, and we didn't believe in any of that stuff. There were some superstitions still, just folk superstitions that were just passed along the way, but they weren't built into the religious system. Mickey says, nowhere I was a bit shocked. Consulting with the dead is divination and necromancy, isn't it? That's what I believe. That's what I think. Susan says, same. Nora says, I was told of a statue of St. Jude. So I guess there's different versions, right? But here's what I also noticed. When you talk to Catholics, like high-level Catholic type guys, they'll talk about relics and artifacts and holy systems and relics, that this piece of a old saint's robe has the power to expel demons. And it's literal medieval superstition. It's medieval spiritualism that you would think had gone away hundreds of years ago. They still do it. And in fact, it's more special to them than ever, because they're doing it despite the modern era. They're doing it because of the fact that it's a tradition and it's ancient. And it's pagan. It comes from pagan roots. Allergic to Bullshit says, singing the names of noblemen in ancient Tibet, like trespassing while singing a song about the owner. Interesting. That's very interesting. Ben says, most of my family and friends still do these things. Mickey says, yep, Jonathan Rumi, who plays Jesus in The Chosen, talks like that. Defenders of Jesus Christ says, exorcism of Emily Rose is real, and they have real tapes of the demon speaking. Pretty wild. Well, I will say this. I believe that the Catholic exorcism system is a fraud. Not because they are faking it. Not because there's no demonic possession, and not because the priests who are involved are in on it. But because Satan actually does cast out Satan in that sense. He possesses somebody and then allows them to torment that person for a while, and then when the priest comes by and he recites his Latin and his stuff, they pretend to go away. But they're surrounded by that whole thing all the time. They all have these weird influences around them, and there's a lot of weird satanic stuff that happens once you try to get out of the system. Defenders of Jesus Christ says, well, she died, so whatever they did not work. Oh, I didn't know that. That's pretty bad. Sandy says, are you spiritually attacked for your ministries? I will tell you this. I've never once felt spiritually attacked since I became a true Christian, in the sense that there was some outside force messing with me. Once I was converted, that process was so devastating and powerful to me, and so thoroughly broke my identity and changed me and forced me to have a recognition of Jesus on the forefront of my mind, because I was so arrogant before that and so full of it before that, and that process converted me to realizing how much I needed Jesus. I have walked confidently in that faith. Of course, I had a sense of guilt, and I had a sense of humiliation and unworthiness that continues to this day, the unworthiness especially, but not a spiritual attack from outside. I didn't fear any spirits. I don't fear any demons. I don't fear possession or attacks from any kind of spirit. If I went into the middle of the Amazon rainforest or some ancient haunted house or anything, I don't care. I'm not afraid of any of that stuff. The Holy Spirit lives within me, and I don't believe that anything can do any harm to me spiritually. But I do think that there are ways that they can try to attack you. Maybe I've just been lucky. But, I don't have that problem, and I just feel more encouraged when people, listen to me, or if I realize that I'm hitting a nerve that is getting into that spiritual realm and people try to attack me because they're resisting me. But I wouldn't say I've been attacked by a spirit or anything like that. Susan says, well, people always wear the symbol of St. Christopher as a necklace, and that's supposed to be for protection. I think I saw about that in The Sopranos, when I watched The Sopranos. Inzom says, that's the whole reason Martin Luther broke away from Catholicism. I thought that was the main reason why he broke away was indulgences. I thought it was indulgences. That's different than this whole mantra system and the praying to saints, right? Baoli says they're just negotiating with their demon in order to appease their followers, but they aren't really doing anything. That's a good way of saying it, Baoli. Thank you for putting it that way. Defenders of Jesus Christ says, it says, do not fear over 300 times in the Bible. You're right. Shadow Raid says, doesn't Jesus say does Satan cast out Satan? Just a thought. Well, a house cannot be divided and stand, right? But the Catholic Church keeps standing, and they seem to be casting out demons, and so in their mind, that's proof that they are attacking Satan and they are redeeming people and they are casting out demons. But these same people will either die in the process or they will go on to be possessed again later on, and they don't have a full salvation. They're not saved in the way that they're saved in the New Testament, which is a very quick command in the name of Jesus, and bang, they're gone. They do this long, drawn-out torture, really. Whenever I've seen an exorcism or I read an account of exorcism, it really seems like they are actually working together, the priest and the demon, to torture the person involved as much as possible. They drag it out for long periods of time, and the person is becoming, doing all sorts of crazy stuff, and they're dragging it out as a painful, evil-looking process. And in the end, the person doesn't have a true Christian, Holy Spirit, full walk of life, like a free and liberated, Christian like we would expect. They're still trapped in the Catholic system. And so that's the thing. I think they play up their own possessions, and then they just dial it down a bit in order to convince themselves that they've exorcised the demon. Defenders of Jesus Christ says, yes, Emily Rose died of malnutrition. Go figure. Well, I didn't even know that, but that is what I've seen, is that they recite these Latin verses over and over for hours and days, and this person is not drinking, they're not eating, they're not being taken care of. They're just being thrown around and tortured. And when the priest eventually, quote unquote, succeeds, and you get 3 bishops together and they've got their holy relics and they're chanting and, doing their dances and whatever they're all doing, which is not biblical at all. There's nothing in the New Testament like that. The person might give up and become exhausted and pass out, but they're not delivered with a beautiful miracle of healing like in the New Testament. Defenders of Jesus Christ says, I believe that was the first time the priest was charged for negligence. Well, I know of so-called Christians who are, even evangelicals. They don't believe in the Catholic system, but the Catholic exorcisms is the thing that keeps them believing that maybe the Catholics are actually right, because we don't do exorcisms. So if we don't do exorcisms and they do, then doesn't that prove that really they have the Holy Spirit and we don't? And just think about the twisted logic of that. God Love says, you never received attacks, Terry Wolf, from evil spirits? Since I was born again, my life changed for the better, but I received attacks. I can feel them, but the Holy Spirit helps me always. I'm not going to say that attacks don't happen to Christians. Maybe I'm lucky and I just haven't experienced them. I've certainly felt a sort of creepiness around people who I believe are possessed or so involved in evil that they're giving off a sort of evil presence, but I wouldn't call that an attack. So, I'm glad that you pray, you rebuke them, and whether it comes in the form of dreams and nightmares or physically when you're around, I think there are accounts in the New Testament of possessed people attacking the saints and spirits trying to attack them and stuff. But yeah, ultimately we do have more power. So it's still not a reason to be afraid. Susan says, I never understood why we needed to know its name. Oh, saying they were supposed to get the name of the demon before they can cast it out. Yeah, I don't know either. Allergic says, trying to use dry fasting to get rid of the demon equals worm. Demons are parasites. Defenders of Jesus Christ says, you are right on point. It's a show, but the demon was saying a lot of stuff, some truth. Yeah, well, demons are beings that can travel around and observe things. So They can know things, and they can guess at things, and they can lie. They can make up a lie even if they don't know the thing. Sean Mack says, that's correct. Get on with the program. One Love, Catholic forever. I don't know what your Catholic forever. That's a strange thing to say at this point. Cindy says, put on the armor of God. And Shadow Raid Legend says, the name of the demon is a Pharisaic Judaism in origin, at least. They had the same rule. Well, we're learning something about that. I'm not a Catholic and I'm not a Jew, but we're learning that there's a lot of overlap. So I'm going to read a little bit more here because this is interesting. In fact, research on biblical prayer compared to the rabbinic prayer has suggested that praying out of the Siddur, i.e. the rabbinical prayer book, is closer to chanting mantras than to prayer found in the Tanakh. The Siddur is composed by the sages, beginning in the 2nd century and was finalized towards the end of the 1st millennium. In contrast to the personal and spontaneous nature of biblical prayer, the rabbinical style of prayer has a fixed text for each and every event. Also, praying from the Siddur must be done in a specific place, i.e. the synagogue, at particular times, morning, noon, and evening, and with a certain kind of people and not others, i.e. no women allowed. All determined by the rabbis. Indeed, the rabbis have decreed when to pray, how to pray, where to pray, and with whom to pray. But in complete contrast, biblical Old Testament prayer is individual, never repetition, and is never restricted to any one place or from anyone. Oh, the next one, I'll just tell you, the next thing they borrowed from paganism in Rabbinic Judaism is astrology. It says belief in astrology and luck. The dependence on astrology and its worship typified the customs of many pagans, such as the Babylonians in Mesopotamia and the ancient Egyptians. The ties between the sages in Israel and the Gentiles led them to believe in astrology, witchcraft, and other superstitions that are completely alien to the Bible. And then it goes on to explain how the Babylonian Talmud has a lot of leftovers from that. Guys, I really hope you do end up checking out Rabbinic Judaism Debunked, whether you can get it for free as a PDF, whether you get it on Kindle Unlimited, you get a physical copy like I have. Rabbinic Judaism Debunked by Eitan Bar and Golan Brosh from One for Israel Ministries, published in 2019, is a gem. It is very valuable. Allergic, I am very glad you joined. I don't know what your background is, but you've said a lot of interesting points. Defenders of Jesus Christ, I'm glad you could come in with some clutch insights as well. This turned out to be a very productive discussion. We have over 17,000 likes on TikTok. Thank you for everybody joining us on YouTube as well. David says, I need to get on with my day, starting up with reading my Bible, picked up the book, thanks. Well, we're about to end, so thank you for joining. Hit the like button wherever you are, if you're on YouTube or if you're on TikTok. I hope you learned something. I'm pretty sure that we all learned something. And so for those on TikTok, here is my link. It is linktree/Wolfpox. The books that I've written are Maybe Everyone is Wrong, Revelations, Conspiracy, and the Kingdom of Heaven, which is a deep dive study of end times prophecy, and Fire in the Rabbit Hole, which is debunking a lot of the New Age mysticism and the end times deceptions such as QAnon and psychedelics and the green movement and all that stuff. So thank you guys. Debbie, thank you for joining. All of you who contributed to the discussion, I thought it was I didn't know what to expect here. It started off very slow, and then it picked up real good. So you know, go ahead and rewatch the entire thing if you want on YouTube. Like I said, the link to everything will be in my link tree. It's in my TikTok bio as well. And then you can go on YouTube and rewatch it and leave comments there and stuff. So, God is Love says shopping to Amazon, buy your book and the one you suggest. Well, if you do, I think you'd be doing, obviously you'd be doing me a favor, and I think you'd be doing yourself a favor. So I will be back tomorrow, Thursday morning at 6:30 a.m. Central. I don't know what we're going to be studying then. We'll probably just continue with Colossians, but today I wanted to shine a spotlight on this amazing book, Rabbinic Judaism Debunked. So thank you all. I believed that we could do this in a spirit of love, and I think we did that. So I gotta go. You guys